Okay, after a weekend of rest, we are very much back. I've been on the grind a little bit today. I figure Blue Key and the Blue Key round robin are coming up. If there's any time to start prepping in earnest, now is the time. And I had some free time today, so I decided to prep a lot more. So I've done a lot, and I've discovered that, interestingly, it is much easier to prep um, in my own time without the camera on me, without having to discuss the reasoning for every single thing that I do. I think there's like good educational reasons to do that, and I will keep doing that in the future. But this video will not be as much like live prep. I'll try to do maybe one document, prep out one case that's on here. But mostly this is just going to be like sitting here and discussing prep that I just did today. Do watch the video though. It'll be interesting. It'll hopefully tell you like the strategic reasoning behind it and how you might use it to its fullest effect and the weaknesses as well, which there are many. Like a lot of these cases are not that good. Cannot lie to you. But I hope that you do take inspiration from this. And I do think that this is like a somewhat reasonable sample of what you might expect to see at Blue Key, not least because I think some people will just take these arguments, but also because I think I've tried more recently, especially to prep the arguments that I think will be most likely. Just as like a brief survey of that, my thoughts on the topic in terms of what the most stock arguments will be. I think maybe this is the most helpful thing for you if you're prepping right now. Like, what should you block out? What should you be prepared to weigh against? I think the pro is going to run three things. They're going to run China escalation. They're going to run China relations. So, like, China and the US don't talk as much when we support Taiwan with more military support, and that impacts a ton of different, like, laundry list of factors. And the third argument is going to be Ukraine trade-off. I think that's going to be the third most popular. I actually think that a decent amount of people will run it, even though I don't think it's the best argument. If I had to pick like a fourth, I would say it's going to be this Glazer AF that I'll show you in a second, which basically says we should just sacrifice Taiwan. It's a Taiwan war inevitable. It should not be nuclear with the US involved. It's better if we just give up Taiwan and focus on other things that are more vital to US interests. The only reason I say this is because there's a good amount of literature on it, not because I think this is a particularly good argument. I've tried to craft it the best I could, but we will try to prep this case out in particular today, because I don't think it's all that great. For the con, I think the most common argument will probably be some version of deterrence. It could also be appeasement. Like deterrence and appeasement are kind of two sides of the same coin. To explain the difference real quick, deterrence says we are currently deterring China. They are not going to war with Taiwan because they don't think they can win. And if we take away military support, that calculation changes and they suddenly think that they can win, or at least have a higher likelihood of thinking that they can win, maybe a higher likelihood of miscalculating in that way. And then they will invade Taiwan without the US there to protect it. This is kind of like a turn on the Glazer F, right? It says, yes, the Glazer F is correct. If you give up Taiwan, like maybe an invasion is going to happen. It does not agree that an invasion is inevitable. It disagrees with the Glazer F on the ability for the US to deter China in the status quo. Appeasement is kind of the flip side of that. It's a slightly different argument. It's not necessarily contingent on deterrence, but it's very related. It doesn't necessarily claim that the US is deterring China right now. It uses other warrants maybe for its uniqueness. Like there are just reasons that China is deterred in general, not just from the US, but maybe even just because it doesn't really want to attack Taiwan even without the US because it would destroy its economy or something like that. At the very least, it makes the same uniqueness claim that China is not attacking Taiwan and is probably not going to in the near future. But the appeasement argument, it differs most in the link and the scope of the impact that it actually manifests in. Because the link argument on appeasement says when we take away US military support, it's not that China suddenly thinks that they can win, it's that they see this as a change in the trend of US behavior. And they see it as a signal from the US that when China does aggressive things like they're doing now, like the exercises just this month that they conducted around Taiwan after the National Day speech, that when China does this aggressive behavior, the result is that the US will back down if it just pushes hard enough. Because that's what China's been doing recently, is they've been increasing and increasing and increasing their aggression around Taiwan and in the South China Sea. And so if we reward that behavior by backing down and giving them what they want, then that teaches them that they can continue to do bad things, to be more and more aggressive, and that eventually, if they're aggressive enough, we will back down, based on this example of doing the AF right now, which actually interestingly provides them an independent incentive to continue aggression, even if they wouldn't want to otherwise aggress. The incentive would be to earn points from the US, earn concessions from the US in the form of the US backing down in terms of other vital areas. And then I mentioned that the difference is really the biggest in terms of the scope of the impact. Because one impact is, yes, just the same Taiwan invasion scenario. Like China then invades Taiwan because we have taught it that we will back down. And in fact, even a little bit different from the deterrent scenario, it might invade Taiwan even if it didn't want to, because it knows that this will earn it even more concessions from the US and maybe change the overall balance of power or like balance of hegemony in the region and in the world. But it also, notably, it doesn't just manifest in Taiwan. It also manifests mostly in the region as a whole and maybe in the rest of the world too, in terms of China's interactions in places that are contested by the US. So, for example, the most pertinent example is probably the South China Sea, maybe the East China Sea with Japan, but mostly the South China Sea, where we might see China stepping up its aggression against the territorial claimants in the region that have overlapping territorial claims, which might set up for potential miscalculations and other conflicts with regional players. And the reasoning would be that China figures that the US will do the same thing, that if it steps up aggression enough around the South China Sea and other parts of the region, then the US will continue backing down and it will earn more concessions. Um, so that's the first argument that I think is the most common on the neg. The second argument that I view as probably the most common on the neg is going to be something like security guarantees. So I've written a lot of security guarantees scenarios today, so I'll show you some of those. The TLDR of this argument is basically what's going to happen is people are going to say if the US backs out, it loses credibility. And so there are two ways this could manifest. One is sort of the appeasement scenario on a global scale, which is that we don't just teach China that aggression wins and that we will back down. We also teach all of the other enemies who might want to do the same thing. So we teach Russia, for example, we teach North Korea, we teach Iran that if they continue aggression, then the US and maybe its allies, the West in general, will back down as long as they continue aggressing as much as possible. This is a bad lesson for other enemies to learn, and maybe they will step up aggression against our allies as a result, knowing that we will back down just like we did with Taiwan. But more pertinently is the effect that this decrease in credibility has on our other allies. This is a scenario that has come up a lot in past topics as well. If you want to look for evidence on it from like the back files, you should look for evidence from a policy topic that was in 2020, I believe, about reducing arms sales. There were a good amount of Taiwan scenarios, Taiwan plan AFs on that topic as well. So there's a good amount of evidence on Taiwan from that topic. I believe the recent college policy topic, not last year, and I think last year was personhood. The year before that was like military alliances. That also has a lot of good evidence. In terms of PF topics, there was a topic in TOC, so April, my senior year in 2020, that was about US military presence in the Middle East. We also recently debated another one about US military like diplomacy in West Asia, which has similar scenarios. And we also debated two other more pertinent topics in the context of Russia, but had the same arguments. So one was a recent September topic about NATO commitments to the Baltics. And the second one was an even more recent topic about US militarization of the Arctic. So all of those topics had the same argument on them, which was about security guarantees and the credibility of US alliance commitments. So you'll find similar evidence across all of them that says the same logic. Obviously, you should cut more specific evidence to the particular scenarios with China and Taiwan in this topic, but the basic logic is the same. So the argument goes like this. If other allies see that the US is going to abandon Taiwan, then they ask the question, oh, will we be next? Will we be the next to be abandoned by the US? And are the US promises really something that we can actually trust, given that we've violated this promise to Taiwan? And it is a promise, by the way, because even though we aren't a formal treaty ally of Taiwan, since there's the whole one China principle, we do still have a law, the Taiwan Relations Act, which was passed in 1979, I think, in the US Congress, that legally commits us to supporting Taiwan with whatever arms that it needs. Now, what it needs is obviously up for interpretation, but that does mean that we have some kind of legally codified promise to military support for Taiwan, even if we're not necessarily legally bound to defend it in the event of a Chinese attack, as we are with other allies in the region like Japan and South Korea and like the Philippines and others. Anyway, what this means is if we abandon Taiwan in its time of need, and especially if China then invades and we don't do anything about it, but either way, if we abandon Taiwan, this can make other allies in the region and around the world very nervous that they might also be abandoned and that our commitment is not very credible, which means that they could do a number of really bad things. One, they might do something called bandwagoning, where they like get cozier with China because they think, if we can't beat them, we should join them. And this might have negative implications for things like American hegemony and democracy in the region. But more likely, I think con teams will make the argument that they will turn to nuclear weapons. They'll be like, if America can't deter China, and if America will abandon us and they won't protect us with their nuclear umbrella, then we might as well get our own nuclear deterrent. And so they will do nuclear proliferation. Most of the allies that we have in the region are not actually capable of doing this. Most notably, like the Philippines, for example, is never going to be able to acquire a nuclear weapon unless like the world turns upside down. But there are a few allies that we have in the region that definitely could, and that actually have tried to in the past with mixed success. South Korea is a big one. They benefit mostly from having a high amount of public support. Recent polls have shown that over 70% of the population actually supports getting a nuclear weapon, but most of them don't really know what it actually would entail, which is a lot of risks that would be involved in the process. And the elites in the government are a little bit less willing to, and the experts don't really agree with them. But that said, there still is a good amount of like healthy support for getting a nuclear weapon in South Korea. And if the US turns away from the region in any way and signals that its credibility is not the greatest, then South Korea might develop its own nuclear arsenal. The same can be said of Japan. Japan has the advantage of having really, really high plutonium reserves, which are necessary for having a very easy breakout period, so they can get a nuclear weapon pretty quickly. And they could like be nuclear armed very quickly relative to other countries. The difference, though, is that they don't have a lot of public support for it at the moment. Obviously, that could change if the calculations change because the US seems less credible. That might give them the public support and the support among elites that they need to actually feel comfortable pursuing a nuclear weapon themselves. There aren't really any others in Asia Pacific that people write about a lot, but obviously there are other countries in like Eastern Europe. There are other countries in the Middle East, Saudi Arabia and Iran. Iran is not an ally, obviously. They would be more the appeasement side of the equation. But Saudi Arabia, for example, might also pursue nuclear weapons. Some people even say that Taiwan itself could pursue nuclear weapons, but it's kind of a special case that we'll talk about in a bit. So those are the first two con arguments I think are going to be the most common. The deterrence escalation scenario with regard to China invading Taiwan, and the wider regional scenarios with regard to appeasement of enemies around the world and the decline of US credibility causing things like nuclear proliferation, or at the very least conventional arms races and like freak out scenarios where allies might act like cornered dogs and start lashing out when they take security into their own hands, even if they don't have a weapon of mass destruction. Those are going to be the two most common neg arguments, in my opinion. If I had to name a third most common neg argument, I don't know. That's a tough question because honestly, I think the vast majority of neg offense centers around those two scenarios. Um, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess we'll see. One thing I missed here though is I did prep a lobbying argument about gridlock. Um, so I'll walk through all of the things that I have prepped since we last talked now. These are all of the different documents that I've made. So I'll walk through them one by one. The first document that I've made was a while ago. This was actually before I took a weekend off of prep. And I prepped just another like headline stock. I didn't cut any of these cards, but you definitely should if any of them catches your eye. At the very least, you might want to read up on them. And at the very, very least, I think it's just really worth it to take a skim through this document and know what evidence is out there. Like know what you could go cut. For example, even if like you hear something in a round that contradicts one of these headlines, you know that this is going to post date because this is like 3 days ago. So you might as well go grab one of these. You could cut the card right then and there in the round or right before the round if you are looking at what the other team has on the wiki, for example. And this will definitely be, I think, worth it to get a good understanding of the topic and also to make our debates smarter. Like I've seen way too many PF debates where people are arguing about things that just like don't make any sense given the current geopolitical environment. So having a survey, like surface level knowledge of what is happening in Asia at the moment. And this document also includes uniqueness about other regions like Europe, like what's happening with Ukraine, for example, what's happening with North Korea, Iran, Yemen, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and the South China Sea. Having a surface level knowledge of the geopolitical circumstances in all of those regions is going to be really, really helpful for making sure that you are like updated and smart on those debates and good in crossfire too, I guess. Bonus ethos for understanding what's happening in the most recent headlines. So let's read through some of the relevant ones here. So we've got sort of the tail end of the aircraft carrier group from China that just sailed through the Taiwan Strait. So just for a little timeline on like Taiwan Strait escalation events, what's happened recently is back in May, President William Lai, who is the new DPP Taiwan president, was elected in 2024. China immediately answered this with, a huge amount of military escalation in the form of military drills in the region and like exercises around the Taiwan Strait. However, even bigger Chinese military exercises occurred just like a week ago around the Taiwan Strait after that same President Lai made a bunch of remarks that China interpreted as provocative in a National Day speech. So China's done two major military exercises in the region that were not planned. After the last one, the US and Canada both sent a warship together through the Taiwan Strait as a freedom of navigation operation where they're basically like, hey, screw you, China. You don't actually own this territory. Which also was somewhat provocative to China. They made some comments that were like, hey, don't do that. That's mean. That is escalatory and creates unnecessary tensions. After that, China did two things. One, they did a routine military exercise, a smaller one, just in the Taiwan Strait and kind of around the South China Sea as well, with some Taiwanese ships too. Not Taiwanese, Thailand ships, some Thai ships as well. So Thailand has a bit of a working relationship with China. They rely on China for arms sales and training so that they can make sure that they defend against transnational threats on their border with Myanmar, which is currently in a civil war. And in turn, they also provide a good testing ground for China and give it more geopolitical clout in the region because it doesn't have a lot of other friends in the region, other than like maybe North Korea, for example, and some of the other like ASEAN nations that are not as much in territorial disputes with China. So that was like routine. There were some headlines that said like maybe this is a little bit provocative. Maybe they're doing even bigger military exercises with Thailand because of Taiwan, but probably not. And then the last thing that China did recently, the most recent thing, is they put like an aircraft carrier group. I think it was the same one as the one that they used for the exercises, which is the Liaoning through the Taiwan Strait, which wasn't really a big deal. Definitely not as big as the military exercises they did earlier, but still, like, I guess, a slight provocation. So we've got the tail end of like the articles about that. This is also like recently there's been a big hubbub because the Taiwan legislature has been discussing plans that they could use to respond to a blockade that China could do and clarifying things like combat readiness. And so they've clarified, they've made it clear that that's a red line for them, that if China blockades them, this is not like a way for them to like avoid deterrence and get away with still coercing Taiwan. Like that would also be a declaration of war. Europe has been backing Taiwan, which makes sense because the former president Tsai Ing-wen just went on a tour there. Um, oh yeah, the South Africa stuff developed a little bit. So I don't remember. I don't know if you remember, but a little bit back, like a few weeks ago, South Africa was sort of coerced by China into telling Taiwan to move its embassy from its capital in Pretoria. Not really an embassy because they don't have formal relations, but like its trade office or whatever. And Taiwan said no. And so that's the current state of affairs there. And like other allies have sort of been actually supporting Taiwan on that. Um, and then what else? They're doing stuff in space a little bit. They have a declining birth rate. They're thinking about economic stuff with the Philippines because they're kind of getting buddy-buddy. They're thinking about reducing climate change, which is good for them. Taiwan is I think the first the first country in the region to legalize gay marriage, which is pretty cool, but that was a little while ago. Pride was a couple days ago, actually. Um, they've got cool balloons. They've got a good economy. They did a trip to Guatemala. They get the special forces, I guess, have new tactical gear from the US, which is good. Maybe there are some leaks of TSMC, which is Taiwan's semiconductor foundry, to Chinese technology, which seems like it's not great. And then there's a lot of question marks around whether or not, if Trump gets elected in the next election, what will happen with relations between the US, Taiwan, and China. So a lot of articles have been published recently about that and like how Harris would change things too. But probably Harris would have more continuity with Biden. Um, and not a lot of other stuff. We've got a lot of other things about nuclear power. If you don't know, Taiwan is phasing out its nuclear power. They used to have far more nuclear reactors, I think as many as 5 or 6 at a time. Most recently, they had 3. They've shut down 2, and they've canceled plans to build more. Now they only have 1 that's working right now, and it's on its way out. Um, and I think they enjoy some popular support for that policy. But ironically, it's a just debate topic that's going to happen in Taiwan that I'm coaching. So it's pretty interesting. Um, and okay, we've got the same stuff as always. For China, not a lot of stuff. North Korea and Myanmar are causing them headaches. A lot of stuff about the economy. Um, I looked up some stuff about the Belt and Road Initiative. Apparently, Brazil and Colombia are thinking of joining it more than they already have. Azerbaijan as well. Um, so it's doing pretty well. It's expanding, it seems, and it's gonna increase in Africa too. China's Belt and Road Initiative, for those of you who don't know, is kind of like a global infrastructure project where China agrees to go build you things like bridges and power plants, and you are in debt to China and you pay it back money. But the loans are like pretty good. There's been worries about like debt diplomacy, like debt traps, and China trying to coerce these other countries. From my research, it seems like it's mostly well intended. I don't know. Maybe it's spreading authoritarianism. There's definitely literature on both sides. Japan seems like they're actually doing okay right now. Their economy is not great, but it seems like they're doing all right. Um, and they've held some drills near Taiwan with the US recently. North Korea has some huge news. For those of you who don't know, North Korea has just sent some troops to Ukraine. It seems like the headlines are kind of fuzzy. It seems like it is true that North Korean troops may either be fighting in Ukraine right now or be on their way to be fighting in Ukraine. They're at the very least in Russia. And so, for those of you who don't know, North Korea has long sent things like drones to Russia to aid in its Ukraine conflict. It's also sent a lot of more missiles and things like that recently. So, it's stepped up its arms sales to Russia to aid in the conflict against Ukraine. But now it seems like it's actually directly engaging. The trade is like North Korea wants combat experience and also will get more weapons and supplies from Russia. In return, they supply more troops to fight in Ukraine. That's really dangerous. It risks like actual escalation to World War type things. Like you drag in more and more countries on both sides of a conflict. It's not a good recipe. And in general, North Korea has been much more bold recently. It's dropped a lot of like they literally do things like they put a bunch of poop in a balloon and then they pop it over South Korea. But it's gone far beyond that recently. They've done much more like development of their nuclear arsenals, development of their nuclear submarines in particular. And it does not look very good. So tensions on the peninsula are certainly rising. And South Korea is super, super angry about what they're doing in Ukraine, and they might start supplying Ukraine with arms, dragging South Korea into the conflict as well. Iran, I have not cut the most recent headlines on Iran. The most recent headlines on Iran are what happened, I think, either yesterday or the day before, which is that Israel finally responded to Iran's strike with a pretty massive strike in Tehran of their own. It seems like a massive regional war has been averted for now, but that is very tenuous peace, and it is possible that Iran and Israel could get dragged into an actual like hot war between the two. Actually, let's look at that because I haven't read any headlines about that for today. So let's check out what's happening between Iran and Israel. Measured comments from Israel and Iran. So that seems good. Some de-escalation, I guess. I think that's what measured would mean in that context. But this is maybe cause for more concern over escalation. Um, yeah, I don't know. Oil prices have plunged. Oh, they plunged. Okay, so oil prices would have risen if Israel hit Iran's energy facilities, because then, people would have thought supply would contract or become much more volatile, and so prices would rise as a result. But that prediction that investors, I guess, had did not occur because Israel did not strike Iran's energy facilities, so oil prices have gone back down. Um, and Iran is very vulnerable, but the strike was limited. So mixed reviews of this Israeli strike on Iran. But this is the important part, I guess. Iran says it probably will respond, which could lead to war, but it doesn't seek war. So possibilities of war in the region, definitely bad. Definitely a bad situation for all involved. But hopefully does not look like a wider regional war for now. Okay, what else is happening? Um, oh, Iran is also holding some naval exercises with Saudi Arabia, which is kind of crazy because they're historical enemies. So this is a sign of maybe warming relations, interestingly, between Iran and Saudi Arabia, as Saudi Arabia no doubt wants to avoid a wider regional conflict that drags it in as well. Um, but an interesting development in their relations. Although, they're also still doing terrible human rights abuses and things like that. Um, Yemen, I've been following. Their conflict kind of keeps getting worse, it seems. Although it seems like peace is still possible. But as you may know, Israel is also attacking the Houthis in Yemen, and the Houthis are attacking Israel. So that has increased tensions there. And the Houthis are, along with Hezbollah and I guess Hamas, if I've got my facts correctly, are a proxy of Iran in the region. Which brings with it the possibility of wider war, although they all kind of function independently. US arms sales, this is just standard stuff. None of this is really different from what you would expect. Germany sent some weapons to Israel. The US is sending weapons to Israel. The US is sending weapons to Ukraine. The US is sending weapons to Taiwan. And then finally, South China Sea stuff. Seems like there's some good things happening, some good news from diplomacy with Malaysia, for example. This is the tail end of the news about China's new radars in the South China Sea. Um, However, a lot of different headlines are also risking of a higher and increasing risk of conflict. Um, and China's planning some more military exercises in the South China Sea. Um, And it seems like that's about it. Okay, so that was a long-winded explanation, but the news is important. You should stay well-read. You should stay updated on what's happening in the region. And I hope that you actually watched and paid attention to that explanation because it is useful to know what's going on. Okay, so that's that. We've covered the news. Now let's get into the juicy stuff that you're actually thinking about. I'll start with all of the con arguments that I've prepped recently. So the first one is the security guarantees argument that I mentioned earlier. I wrote, let's see, no, not this document. Um, Here we go. South Korean proliferation. So I wrote this argument. This is just security guarantees with an example of South Korea. So the first card is it's not really uniqueness. It's just domestic law has required us to support Taiwan with our military, which means that if we vote AF, that is a breaking of a promise that we've made. Presumably, normal means might even require that we roll back the Taiwan Relations Act, which would be crazy. But you might also be able to argue if you're AF that this is not what it looks like, that actually the Taiwan Relations Act will remain stable, which ensures that the reduction in military support does not actually look like full abandonment, which I actually think is a good strategy from the AF to employ. But if we do break our promise, this will trigger fears of abandonment across our other alliances as well. This card is great. It's a response to Charles Glazer, who we will look into later with the Glazer AF. And it has a lot of stuff about security guarantees. It says the best line here is that it could easily bring down the entire hub and spoke system of alliances that US policy relies on in the region. The example that I give in this security guarantee scenario is South Korea. So I've got two cards with good uniqueness. So this one says South Korea has increasing support for nuclear weapons, and they're like closer to getting nuclear weapons than ever before, and they totally could. But they're still not there. The government is still saying no. And so they're sort of on the edge. And then this is the same sort of card, but maybe slightly better. It says that the scenario of prolif is closer than ever before. America's tried to reassure them, and in recent statements, they've talked down the chances of going nuclear. So it seems like the uniqueness is on our side right now. There's not a lot of chance of prolif in the status quo, and they have lots of good reasons not to prolif. There's like lots of reasons that they would be deterred from things like sanctions. However, we could stoke doubts. This article is in the context of Trump getting elected. So it says if Trump, they're actually both, I think, in the context of Trump getting elected. So if Trump gets elected, then maybe South Korea, because Trump is not as credible on maintaining the alliance with South Korea and coming to its defense, maybe they would be much more likely to pursue nuclear weapons. Although notably, it also later says that that wouldn't be that high of a risk. Let's see, where does it say that? It says Mr. Trump could stoke fears. It says it somewhere, maybe in the other article. Oh yeah, here. Trump may not prove as disruptive as many fear, and then it explains some reasons why. So maybe this is not a huge non-unique, even if the other side reads some evidence that Trump is going to get elected. And also, like, it seems like polls between Harris and Trump are kind of 50-50 right now. So even that non-unique would be a resting 50% chance non-unique, which would not be terminal defense by any stretch of the imagination. But this at least proves the same logic that if we do something like electing Trump, but if we do anything that would reduce our credibility in the region, which the previous link card says that the AF would, then this risks changing the calculation in South Korea, pushing them over the edge to actually getting nuclear weapons. And then we have Hal Brands. The title of this article, ironically, is something that he never says in the article itself, but I highlighted it anyway, which is that if South Korea gets nuclear weapons, the rest of the world will as well. It talks about the NPT. It's been a good achievement right now, so good uniqueness. And it also says that the odds are against South Korea building the bomb right now, which is also good uniqueness. But if it does happen, which is on the edge, and might happen in an AF world, then proliferation would definitely increase, and it would not just increase with South Korea, it could increase in places from Eastern Europe to East Asia. And this is a great line here. If the US pulls back, which is presumably the AF, it's specifically in the context of China invading Taiwan, but you could make the same logical analysis that any decreases in American credibility would cause this. Then erstwhile allies from Eastern Europe to East Asia might feel that they face a choice between nuclear proliferation and national suicide, which is a good way to preempt a lot of the responses you might get about how they might face sanctions or backlash or threats if they do this. It's like existential, so they would do it anyway. It's like try or die for them to get nuclear weapons, or they feel that it is at least. And this is probably the best line of the article. If the US removes power and commitment, the non-proliferation order could crumble in many places at once, and this would cause global proliferation of nuclear weapons. And then I cut a bunch of cards from Logos Debate. I used this in one of the previous videos, but if you don't know what Logos Debate is, this is a search engine for policy debate created by Tyler Virgo of Dartmouth. I think it includes both the high school wiki and the college wiki. So if you search for any cards, for example, this is a card that I did not find earlier. If you search for something like Taiwan Prolif, then you'll get cards like this, like no chance of Taiwan Prolif, a bunch of no Taiwan Prolif actually. Here's like a card that you could use for this topic. Abandoning or losing Taiwan decks US credibility causes allied prolif. And yeah, lots of different cards. So if you ever want to find any card that you think is a generic, like policy sounding card. So I've used this, for example, for prolif impact cards. I've used this for US-China war causes extinction. Then you should look here. I will say these cards are not specific to this topic, and they're very generic, and sometimes they're wildly miscut, or at the very least, very much power tagged. So take it with a grain of salt and don't rely too much on this, just like you shouldn't rely too much on my prep or the wiki. Do your own prep, you will know it inside and out better, and you should not rely on this kind of stuff that can be really shady. But it's pretty good for generic cards like Prolif Impact Scenario. So here are a few good cards that I found. This one says that you might have terrorists if you have more Prolif, because it's easy for them to acquire nuclear weapons from new nuclear states that are not well protected. And it might also cause this card is like the classic that everyone reads, Kronig 15, might cause extinction from a number of different reasons. This is a really long card, but a ton of different warrants in the card for why there might be a use of nuclear weapons with much more proliferation. There's like use it or lose it pressures where countries feel that they have to use their nuclear weapons because they don't have a second strike capability yet, or else they might get destroyed before they're able to use them. And so there's a use it or lose it pressure when you first build nuclear weapons. They could also have accidents that nearly led to war in like the Cold War and the Cuban Missile Crisis specifically. And even in a world of mutually assured destruction, there's a huge risk of nuclear war. So lots of different warrants embedded in here that circumvent mutually assured destruction, which is the typical link defense. There's also reasons that this might suggest that like actually specifically among types of nuclear war scenarios, new nuclear powers that have just engaged in nuclear proliferation hold a special place that is a higher chance of nuclear war than mature nuclear powers like the US, China, and Russia. Because mature nuclear powers, they already have good command and control. They have a history of operations. They have good second strike capabilities. So they don't feel the pressures to use it or lose it as much. And they're less prone to accidents. Plus, they have things like hotlines that are well established, that they can like use diplomatic channels to make sure that there aren't accidents or that those accidents don't escalate to like Armageddon. Whereas new nuclear powers are much less equipped to do all of those things, much more equipped to like accidentally hand their nuclear control over to lower level commanders who are pretty trigger happy or like accidentally lose their nuclear weapons to terrorists and things like that. So new nuclear powers seem like they're much more likely to actually engage in nuclear war that could escalate than mature nuclear powers. So that is one piece of weighing that you can use on any prolif scenario. And then we've got this last card that I also found from Logos. That's another generic card that's a bit power tagged that says like if we have a strong NPT, which we seem to have right now, and we don't weaken it, which the AF would presumably do if the link is true, then we can actually use the NPT as an international norm bedrock to develop other multilateral treaties as well, or even informal arrangements that contribute to a decrease in nuclear weaponization, even among mature powers, and a decrease in the chances of things like miscalculation. So it's been the bedrock of a norm that spawned multilateral measures to protect against nuclear conflict, for example. A huge W for diplomats. It made the world a safer place. So NPT might be able to solve their impact scenario as well. Or at the very least, like, is a blanket check back against multiple kinds of nuclear war scenarios across the globe, which can serve as some nice scope weighing for your link against any nuclear scenario that they have. Also, it's like an independent link as to, or internal link to nuclear war as to why the NPT is important. Okay, so enough of that. That example, though, is just South Korea, and you don't necessarily need to just constrain yourself to South Korea. I plan to write something like Japan prolif later, because that's the other logical option. They have, great plutonium reserves, and they totally could do it. They threaten to do it every time the US does anything that threatens its commitments. Um, so let's go check out what a generic version looks like without any example. So this is a generic version. Where is it? Here. That's just like the direct hop from link card to NPT impact. Because technically this link is sort of sufficient without South Korea as an example. And technically Brands also is sufficient without South Korea, because again, he hardly even talked about South Korea in the article, even though the title is about South Korea. So this one is just like a generic prolif scenario for all kinds of allies, and you can slot in examples if you want to, or just leave it as like a vague list of allies, which might make it harder for them to respond to it with specific like evidence that like Japan can't prolif or South Korea can't prolif or something like that. It's the same cards as before, so breaking our promise triggers alliance collapse, undermining credible commitments to defend allies can kill the NPT, and then just like the same three internal links to nuke war as before, I've just explicitly enumerated them this time. So one, terrorists; two, all of the different like use it or lose it pressures and command and control. And then the third one is the NPT like is actually a bedrock for other multilateral arrangements that decrease the chance of nuclear war. So you could use this on its own, it's quite generic, or you could slot in any example like South Korea or Japan or other examples maybe. It would be a bit more of a stretch to go for something like Saudi Arabia, but it could be done. Just because they're one less proximate to the region and therefore slightly less affected by cred in the region. presumably, but there are reasons why cred, spills over globally. And two, there are a lot of good reasons why Saudi Arabia does not have as much capacity to get a nuke, although there are also reasons that they might be able to like get one from Pakistan, or somehow develop their own domestic capabilities enough that they could eventually get one. Though it seems I would be skeptical of that. Um, okay, so that's the first two con arguments about prolif. You'll see that there's another one here about Taiwan prolif. This one only is one card right now because I can't for the life of me find a card that says Taiwan prolif has like a substantial impact. Taiwan is weird because it's like not in the NPT, so it doing prolif does not seem to necessarily break the NPT and then cause this cascade. The reason it's not in the NPT is because it's not officially recognized as a country, which gives it a weird special position. This could make the threat even worse, actually, but it also might make the threat less bad because it doesn't necessarily break the international backbone of the non-proliferation regime if it does prolif. But this is a good link card that, Taiwan did pursue nuclear weapons for a bit, so it clearly can. And they might be tempted if they don't think that there's any other action that they can deter a Chinese invasion, aka if the US abandons them, right, would be the link. And this is uniqueness. It's not happening now, but its calculus could change. And so the US must redouble its efforts to make Taiwan safer, which I guess would be a solution. So if you just read like generic, like prolif bad stuff on this, I guess that would work. Although I think that the scenarios seem a little bit less bad for Taiwan. That said, I've actually used the same exact card for a scenario on the Pro that I will show you in a bit. That's just an impact turn on this that says, actually, yeah, Taiwan prolif will happen, and that's good. It's the only way to deter China. The last thing on prolif that I've done is I cut this other sort of different channel by which South Korea can get nuclear weapons. So if you run into a bunch of people that are running like South Korea, prolif, impossible, and they have like a bunch of good defense, one thing you can do to circumvent that is run this nuance scenario. You'll see this warning at the top. This is like the evidence here is a little bit questionable. I haven't miscut it, but it doesn't have much of a link to the topic. It's like nowhere in the evidence does it say like a US reduction in military support would cause this to happen. It's kind of my interpretation, but you could sub this in for the South Korea prolif argument as an example, and just sub in like actually instead of prolif, they do this, which is a nuclear sharing agreement like NATO has, where the US literally stations nuclear weapons on South Korean soil, or even allows them to use them itself. This is kind of like what the US had with Turkey for a while during the Cold War, and I think still does today at the Incirlik Air Base. And with some other countries, like I think Germany also has some US nukes, and other NATO powers might as well. The idea, and this has happened in the past with South Korea as well. Like earlier, I think, yeah, in 1991, we withdrew our nuclear weapons from South Korea, but they were there before then, to deter against North Korea. However, there's a possibility that South Korea asks for them back if it gets panicky enough. This evidence says that if the North Korean threat steps up enough, then South Korea would ask for us to give them the nukes back. But you could extrapolate the same logic to say that if they feel threatened enough, aka if our credibility in the region decreases, or if China engages in more aggression, or whatever the scenario might be, you could link it into this kind of thing. They would ask for a nuclear sharing agreement, and the impact is that China and North Korea could retaliate. And there's a little bit of fancy cutting here that, like, kind of links into nuclear war, maybe, but it's questionable. The link here that's definitely not in the evidence, except maybe this first line, is a hidden link that you could read that I think is logical, but no one is really writing about, so it's going to be hard to find cards that say this. The link would be something like, if the US reduces military support for Taiwan, it will step up military support in other places around China because it wants to maintain containment of China and avoid the appeasement scenarios that the other neg arguments will talk about. So this might be hard to read with appeasement unless you read like they will try to do this and then it will fail, which means they will both do this and not and continue to appease China somehow. But probably it's an either or situation. But the advantage of reading this argument is you can kind of read something like a yo-yo scenario or like a boomerang scenario, where the US will draw out of the region in one part, Taiwan, and then come back in another part in order to make sure that it's continuing its strategy of containment against China, which won't change. So, people in the US government, for example, will be like, oh no, we can't reduce military support for Taiwan unless we find other ways to contain China that can fill in for that. It's like a balloon effect. You push down on one, the other part increases. And this might turn a lot of the arguments on the AF about US presence provoking China or causing miscalculations or accidents. And it might take the form of something like this, which is a South Korean a nuclear sharing agreement that could do just that and possibly cause a nuclear conflict. It also probably turns a lot of the links on like the AF relations arguments because it might provoke China even more and cause them to stop talking with us, which would be strategic for the Neg to run. But the literature is not really there. The last argument I prepped on the Neg is another stretch. I prepped this for a practice round that I did over the weekend on this topic. It's not a good argument, but it exists. If you can find like better evidence on it, or if you really, really well warrant it, then maybe you can run it. It's like an idea that maybe is a liftoff point for you, spark some inspiration. But for now, it's not super viable, I think. The argument is about gridlock within Congress in the US. So the Taiwan lobby is a really, really powerful interest group within the US that it's like a multitude of different groups from Taiwan and US groups that are associated with Taiwan that are all fighting for the US to get to have more support for Taiwan. So there's like literature in here that says, for example, that Pelosi's visit to Taiwan in 2022, which was like probably the peak of US political support for Taiwan, might have been a result of Taiwanese lobbying in US Congress. They pull lots of different levers to get Congress to do different things that support Taiwan. So Congress, the executive branch, think tanks, and the media have apparently all been influenced by Taiwan and the Taiwanese lobby in particular. And they've also definitely, in particular, they've been trying to get the US to step up military commitments and military support to Taiwan for a very long time. So that's what the evidence says. What the evidence does not say is the next part, which is the link, which is that this is all extrapolation for me. It sounds a little bit stupid, but the argument is that, they don't know about durable fiat. So the argument is that if we vote affirmative and if Congress stops having more military support for Taiwan, then the Taiwan lobby will get really mad and they'll be like, they'll start investing all of their efforts as much as possible into reversing the policy and to actually returning US military support for Taiwan and increasing it above the new low threshold that it would be after the affirmative has passed. And obviously, this wouldn't be able to happen because fiat is, at least to some extent, durable. We wouldn't immediately turn around and negate the policy after affirming it, which means that they would be soaking up political capital, causing a lot of discussions in Congress that go nowhere, basically. And the argument is that those discussions in Congress that go nowhere, they trade off with other discussions that Congress should have, and they create something like gridlock. It's maybe a bit of a misuse of the word gridlock, but it at least slows down Congress from being able to pass other policies that are more important. And so there's a card that says gridlock is bad. It's like caused by more lobbying. This is probably talking about more like corporate lobbying, which is definitely non-unique. But I guess the Taiwan lobby could also cause this. And then there's this card that I cut from Logos again that just says gridlock is like the most important impact. It's, obviously it links into like any other scenario because the US has to pass good policies to manage things around the world. And if it passes bad policies, then bad things happen. Even this card, Loki, is a bit miscut from Logos, I'm not gonna lie, because it doesn't really talk about gridlock. It mostly talks about just like bad political decision making. But I guess, yeah, similar logic. If we have less policies, then I guess we have worse policies too. Or maybe the policies we do pass, they pass more like in fits and bursts because we're soaking up all of our conversation abilities. So the policies we pass are less thought out. But that's all a little bit of an extrapolation from the evidence. The evidence doesn't really say all that much that's important. But with the state of PF these days, you could certainly get away with running this argument. And it's at least different enough from the stock that maybe some people will take some inspiration from it. Cool. So that's all of the stuff that I've prepped for the neg. Now let's turn to the app.